welcome. Welcome, friends. Get started in just a minute here. All right, forgive me if there is any technical difficulties. This is the one and only time I've ever used IG Live, so it's a bit of an experiment. Just give it another minute in case anyone else is arriving. Hey, Michelle, welcome. All right, we'll get started here. So welcome, thank you for joining me. My name is Hope. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm currently coming to you from Brooklyn, New York, unceded Lenape land. I'm an artist, graphic designer, illustrator, yoga facilitator, and today I just wanted to pop on and talk a little bit about a topic that is very near and dear to me personally, professionally, which is the intersection of art and yoga and how those two things interrelate, both practically but also historically, philosophically, sociologically, and one of the ways in which these two things interrelate is through the lens of cultural appropriation, which is something that we talk about a lot on this platform. And there's a ton of, juice to this particular topic that I would love to get into, but I'll try to keep it concise for today. I'm gonna share some slides here for a little visual besides just my head. So these two images side by side really speak to this kind of intersection, this parallel between yoga and art history that I want to talk about. And when I was searching for reference imagery, there was a lot that I had in mind that was actual art. And then it occurred to me that one of the ways in which that we see art and yoga being appropriated in a similar way is the sort of aggressive decontextualization that happens in the West. And so in this image, you'll see on the top is sort of your modern yoga space, And then on the bottom is an art gallery in New York City. And it's hard to tell from this image, I think, but at this size, but on the walls there are several pieces of art from India from, I want to say, like the 18th, 19th century. And putting these two images side by side, you really see this distinct sort of match of these two incredibly important cultural resources from South Asia being put in this really sort of stark, white, all white space with, you know, like sort of largely featureless, and you take these two cultural practices and you stick it in this context, and it completely changes the way in which we view these things. And I think, you know, it also speaks to the sort of sterilization. We talk about sterilization a lot when we talk about cultural appropriation in yoga. And part of that sterilization is that sort of feeling of like clean lines and cold interiors that you see in a lot of yoga studios in the West. And that trope of, you know, like the minimalist all white yoga space is also a trope, you know, amongst artists and people who work in art institutions and the art world, of the cold white, all white gallery with, like, you know, you'll have a piece of art that's colorful and bright, and then it's, you know, in this all white stark space. And I don't know, like putting these two images together really felt like it spoke to that in an interesting way. And it also sort of symbolizes to me as like a metaphor for the effects of colonialism on both of these two disciplines or pursuits or, you know, cultural reference points. So, you know, we, again, like this topic could go in all directions, and, you know, we could all sit here and write dissertations on it, but really it's important to just ask the question, like, why does this even matter, right? Like, why are we talking about this particular topic at this moment and like on a yoga platform when it's, you know, it's pretty specific to art, and maybe it's not obvious right away what the relationship is. So we're gonna change slides here. Forgive me, I'm an old fogey and I am taking a moment here. All right, so why are we talking about this? Why does it matter? First of all, we live in a cultural context that's incredibly visual. Our entire economy relies on visual communication, top to bottom. And that includes the yoga industry, this industry that's worth billions and billions of dollars, projected to only increase in value, relies on the visual, right? A lot of the time when we are having the conversation of cultural appropriation in yoga, a lot of times what we're talking about has, you know, like a visual component. So we might be talking about maybe the way that we perceive a visual image of what a yogi looks like or what a yoga practitioner looks like. So it might be, you know, one version of that might be like someone very fit and thin in like a matching athleisure outfit. And then, you know, it also might look like a white person, you know, with dreadlocks, wearing a kurta and sitting under a tree and meditating, right? So we have this like strong visual relationship between yoga and like what we as a culture perceive yoga to look like. And this image of the yogi or the yoga space, or the images that we associate with yoga spaces, is very much embedded in our cultural consciousness in sort of a sneaky way. And another aspect to this, to why it's important, is, you know, as Desi yoga practitioners, we unfortunately are sort of given the task of understanding how colonialism, the processes of extraction and exploitation of South Asian culture, how it's happening and where it's happening, and understanding that it's happening at every level, and there's it's a multi-layered thing, right? It's not just yoga is being colonized and this thing is being colonized, and it's two separate things. Like, they're very, very interrelated. And in order to really understand what's happening and to, how to make effective changes, we need to be able to understand how these two things are related and how other forms of appropriation are related. And it just generally having a critical lens on dominant culture is an asset when we're having the conversation about decolonizing yoga and decolonizing museums and all these other things that, again, are very much related. So, next slide. I wish there was just a button for this. Here we go. So, what does this process look like, right? What is this process of colonization and of yoga and colonization of image making and indigenous forms of art traditions? What does this sort of passage through time look like? So the colonial extraction and exploitation of yoga and South Asian spiritual practices really parallels that of the exploitation and extraction of images, art, systems of visual communication that also come from India, South Asia. And so it sort of follows this. I'm very much distilling this into a bite-sized little chunk here for the sake of the conversation we're having. It's obviously like a deep process in history, but for the sake of this conversation, I'll distill it to a few sort of notable aspects of the process. So initially, we see the British colonizers sort of encountering South Asia and encountering a deeply unfamiliar culture and sort of having this initial read on it as being primitive, inferior, lesser, other, and sort of from the art perspective against the conventions of European art, which was, by Europeans considered to be a superior set of conventions, such as, like three-point perspective and techniques, traditions along those lines. And, the spiritual practices and forms of image making, both the sort of more, how should I say this, sort of courtly kind of art making that you see royalty sort of having, patronizing artists, as well as like folk art traditions, generally seen as being lesser and largely seen as being primitive. And then from there, you sort of move into a stronger sense of not just that these art traditions and spiritual traditions are primitive and foreign and lesser, but also that they're sort of problematic and threatening in some way. And it kind of goes beyond, hey, look at those, primitive indigenous people, into sort of an assertion of cultural dominance through erasure and like the demonization of these indigenous practices. Hi, Raika. And yeah, that becomes a form of colonial dominance. And in that process of erasure and demonization, you can see how we kind of ended up here with these forms of cultural expression being extracted from the indigenous people and sort of picked apart and separated. And you see that coming to fruition in our contemporary context. You also see then it sort of turns towards a more, as Europeans, as colonizers, became more accustomed to sort of seeing imagery and hearing stories and familiarizing themselves with the subcontinent, you start to see these cultural forms of expression becoming sort of a curiosity, like an oddity from a foreign land. Like it becomes like a sideshow, right? Like it becomes something to be gawked at in almost like a voyeuristic way. And you do see like ephemera from the colonial occupation that, like postcards and things with like images of like wandering sadhus and all sorts of things that through a European lens, you see that and it looks totally foreign and it's treated as a curiosity. But when something is a curiosity, the more people that have eyes on it, the more demand there is for consuming more of it, right? You create interest through that lens of curiosity. And as interest in knowledge about India, art from India and South Asia, and of yoga and yogic practices became more in like the cultural consciousness in Europe and amongst the colonial presence in India, you start to see a market for this stuff emerging. And sorry, one sec. There we go. So once, there's enough interest and a market begins to emerge, we begin to see the commodification of these things, which is done in a way that sort of supports the perspective of the like white colonial gaze, right? So that's when you start to see the sort of dismantling and the decontextualization of these things as they're meant to be, becoming filtered through this colonial gaze, colonial framework. So we, again, this is a yoga platform, and so I am kind of making the assumption that most of us have a sense of what this looks like within yoga institutions, right? Within YTTs and yoga studios, the entire industry. So what does that look like in art institutions, art schools, art museums, things like that? Unsurprisingly, very similar situation. So you see a severe lack of representation of South Asian artists just in general, both in institutional contexts that are like more focused on history, like somewhere like the Met or like a larger institution that has tons of historical art and artifacts. You also see this happening in art schools, in institutions that are like based on educating artists. You don't see a lot of faculty of color in general, but for the purposes of this conversation, South Asian faculty. And South Asians are just not well represented. And then, again, same as with the yoga industry, the people that tend to be in positions of power in the art world tend to be white. So people that are on the boards of museums, people that own galleries, people that represent artists, curators, art historians, all of those things. So, those are the people that have control of the narrative and often have control over who comes in and out, right? So those are sort of the gatekeepers of the industry. Just going to keep an eye on the time here. Another aspect of this is that a lot of the art from South Asia that you do see in large institutions and even in smaller collections has literally, like, the literal definition of stolen during the colonial occupation and after, actually. There's just like a lot of looting that happens as a result of the general, like, cultural extraction. So you see a lot of art institutions profiting off of stuff that was literally stolen. And yeah, again, to my earlier point, like, whoever is in power is telling the story. Whoever is in power is creating the narrative that our culture absorbs. And so telling the story of visual communication, image making, art traditions of South Asia is in the hands of Westerners, of white folks. And so they're not telling the story from an indigenous perspective. And, as we well know from, experiences in yoga, a lot of the, not only critical to the practice, critical to, like, a base of knowledge, but also just out of, like, sheer on principle, right? Respecting a craft, respecting an art form, respecting the process, respecting artists, all of that is ignored in favor of extraction, which leaves out the historical and cultural context. So a lot of times when we're seeing, not even necessarily in museums, but when we're encountering images of South Asia, from South Asia, it's not under the context of the conversation around colonialism. All right, so art museums are kind of boring, let's be real. What does this look like outside of, like, large cultural art-based institutions? We've all seen it, right? In popular culture, we see South Asian imagery appropriated constantly. Everything from, symbols and written language, right? Going into a white-owned yoga studio and seeing a big Om symbol on the wall, like it's, just like a piece of decor they saw on Pinterest or whatever, to, fashion companies that get fabric from Indian manufacturers and aren't paying the workers a fair wage, right? So we see this happening in popular culture all the time. And we're not just talking about, like, paintings and things that hang on walls, right? We're talking about an entire system of visual communication that has developed over the course of literally thousands of years, that's just being, like, taken out of context, picked apart, throwing away the bits we don't like, and then regurgitating it for a white audience, right? So it's stripping, not just taking images out of context, but also sort of bastardizing the entire system of visual communication. And, when we talk about yoga being appropriated, art being appropriated, anything being appropriated, a lot of the time we're talking about experiential things, right? So when we practice yoga, it's not just, you can read a book that's how to practice yoga, but reading the book doesn't really help you. What helps you is the experience of the practice. And it's kind of the same with art, right? You can read a book about art history, but none of that means anything unless you are able to engage with the art, whether it's music, whether it's visual art, whatever it is. So part of the reason that this sort of exploitation, appropriation happens so insidiously is because art, and like yoga, is an experiential thing. It's an experiential practice, and it's an experiential, it has to be experienced in order to interact with it, which leaves a lot of room for, I don't want to say interpretation because that's giving people too much credit, but sort of putting your own spin on things. So, oftentimes we use art to express things that cannot be distilled in language. In a similar way how like a Bij mantra might not have a literal linguistic translation, but it still has meaning, and the experience of chanting or listening brings that embodies the meaning for you. And the extraction of this and the exploitation of these things strips away our ability to engage with our source culture and express our relationship to our source culture in an authentic way. So it's like this continuing cycle of sort of disempowerment. And if something is poorly understood and it's being misrepresented over and over and over and over again through time, and the teachers are teaching the next teachers to teach the wrong way, and then they're teaching their students to teach the wrong way, right? We're creating this like cumulative effect of just like burying the truth underneath the commodified version of things, which causes severe cultural harm to the source culture. So it's pretty depressing. So what can we do about it? That's really, really the question. So one thing you can do, honestly, like if you're feeling an emotional response and you're like, I want to do something, reflect on your own experiences with art. If you're a South Asian person, think back to the earliest images you have in your mind of art from your source culture. Just like think about it, reflect on it, consider the impact that it has on you, and consider how it makes you feel when you think about it, when you look at it. Even just that can be really liberating, right? It can give us a sense of ownership over our relationship to our culture. Another thing is to learn about cultural restitution, which is happening right now. There are people working tirelessly to reclaim artifacts that are in museums that were looted and stolen. There's a whole organization of people who literally volunteer their time to do this. And it's difficult. It's really hard. It's really hard to get, to get institutions to let go of things that they profit from, right? So learn about that. I'll have a couple slides in the abcdyogi stories where you can access some folks that do that work. And then honestly, like, there are artists who are alive right now who are carrying on the cultural traditions of art making as South Asian people. You see how I'm talking with my hands? It's like such a Punjabi moment. But they're real and they're alive, and we can support them, right? We can highlight them and buy their work and, go to their gallery shows. And, it's, we talk about art history, but like art history is happening right now, right? Like it's not as if South Asia was colonized and then, the art stopped, right? So support the people that are doing the work right now to carry on our visual culture. And that's about it. We're about out of time, so that's all I got, folks. Thank you for coming to my little 30-minute TED Talk. This was really fun. Thank you, Raika, for making it happen and encouraging me. I would love to, if folks have, I'm going to have, thanks, Raika. I'm going to have some stories in the abcdyogi stories, I'll tag a bunch of South Asian artists that I like, a couple of organizations, platforms that are supporting South Asian artists and platforming them. So there will be plenty of resources. Yeah, that's it. Thanks, folks. Thanks for coming.